Well, welcome back to another episode. This time it's the Range Rover Sport. And the Range Rover Sport is a very interesting vehicle for Land Rover because while some people will consider the first generation to not be a proper Range Rover, and I'll come on to that in just a second, it actually is a little bit of a circle moment for the company's history. And that's because the original Discovery, the Discovery 1 that came out in the very late 80s, early 90s, was based on a Range Rover chassis. And it was supposed to be the more sort of affordable, everyday Land Rover model that was just below the sort of luxury marker that Range Rover had tried to make itself stand out for in the off-road section. When the Range Rover Sport comes in, it's trying to carve out another part of the off-road market, this being the sportier SUV sector. And what it does is it takes the Discovery chassis. Now, because of that, as I say, you'll have some people who think, oh no, Discovery Sport, not a proper Range Rover, etc., etc. Actually, the Range Rover Sport, not Discovery Sport. Actually, that's not really the case here. And although the first generation isn't built on the same chassis as the L322, because that would have made it a much, much larger vehicle, the chassis that was put under the L322 generation that came out in 2001 was designed to always be that larger SUV, larger Range Rover, full-size Range Rover model. And so what we get on the first generation, coming out in 2005, is this semi-monocoque. So it's sort of a half monocoque chassis on the sort of traditional, what some people will call a ladder chassis, some people will call chassis on frame, some people, there's a lot of different variations here, but basically your regular sort of off-road chassis underneath that you would see on everything from a truck to an SUV to larger vehicles, buses, things like that. On top of that, then you've got the actual body of the car put on. So it does have a little bit of a double chassis going on, but kind of designed to work as that way instead of just plonking on a monocoque on top of that sort of frame underneath it. That does mean, and this does sometimes get confused, so just to be clear on this one, the Range Rover Sport can be split in two. So use this bolt holding the monocoque chassis, or the semi-monocoque, on top of the frame. And if you undo those bolts, you can, just with a ramp, lift the body off the frame. You can't do that with the full-size Range Rover of this time, and it does get a little bit confused sometimes. So, let's start off with this first generation, and I'll give a personal view that I've driven pretty much every Range Rover Sport there is, and from driving them, it does drive differently. If you're driving the second generation, the full-size and the Sport, they don't feel that different. There is some differences, but they don't feel that different because they share a chassis. In this generation, there are some differences. The key one is, while a Range Rover does have, the full-size Range Rover does have that slightly, I don't want to call it a sharper turn-in, really. It's not, because it really isn't. But it has a slightly sharper connection between what you're doing at the steering wheel and the on-road handling. Okay. When it comes to the Range Rover Sport, you do feel like you're sort of directing a chassis underneath the vehicle. There is, if you really are finely tuned in your mind and you've driven lots of different cars, you can notice the difference. The way I always describe it is there's a little bit of a sort of a floating feel. So as you turn, you feel the front of the bonnet is turning away from you and you're sort of going with it. It's a very difficult sensation to describe. But the best ones to buy, probably two that stand out. The reason these two stand out is predominantly because they fit two different age ranges. And I'll come on to the very late versions of these in just a second because there's some interesting aspects to that. But you get the first models, 2005, with they have these Vesuvius orange paintwork. It's sort of like this first edition, this launch edition. And it's based on the Range Rover Stormer, which was the concept car released and seen in 2004, which was a three-door sort of really sporty Range Rover. And the production version, it was five-door. They weren't going to do a three-door. But they wanted to keep some of that essence. And if you can find one, not only do they have the 4.2 Supercharged V8, which has proven itself to be a pretty reliable engine. There's some of those knocking around with 200,000 miles on, which are still going. As engines go, especially within Land Rover where people are a little bit more critical, the Range Rover Sport engine, the 4.2 Supercharged, the same goes into the full size. That's actually a very reliable engine for this generation car. It's not that fuel efficient. it is what it is. You're going to have to accept that it's not that fuel efficient. But if you are looking at one of those early ones, the reason I would look at just the 4.2 supercharged, unless you also have the 4.4 V8, if you've got the 4.4 V8, that's probably that's one of their most reliable, powerful, reasonable fuel economy engines that they have across this entire era of Land Rover at the time. It really is one of those engines, as I say, it doesn't have some of the maintenance issues of the diesels. It has worse fuel economy, but you know, depending on where you are in the world and what fuel prices are, because that will be a big factor, it's not unacceptable. That's the way I'd probably put it. There are some cars that I've driven that you drive it and you think, this is great fun, but I could never own one because the fuel economy is unacceptable. So early ones, if you can get a 4.2 supercharged, and if you get one in Vesuvius Orange, you've probably got a little bit of a collector's car there. If not, they have then HSE specification, something like that with a 4.4 would be great. At the time, there's 2.7 TDV6. I'm going to be honest, they're 20 years old now. Any 20-year-old diesel car will probably need some maintenance, and this wasn't the most reliable to begin with. It was a compromise engine from the beginning. So the PSA group, the French Peugeot, wanted a 2.5 diesel engine. Land Rover wanted a 3-litre diesel engine. The two of them were working on it. Sorry, not Land Rover. Ford at the time, because Ford owned Land Rover in this period, wanted a 3-litre diesel engine. And so you kind of got this compromise happening where you get a 2.7 that goes in. And it seems to do okay in Jaguars. I think maybe the Land Rovers are just a little bit heavy for it. And because of that, there's some known issues, especially around the crank, and the crank sort of just snapping. The 3-litre, which I'll come on to in just a second, some people will say that's even worse. Some people will say it's better. Some people will say it has different issues. To be honest, I don't want to get too far into it because it becomes a big argument, and I don't know why. But there's a known issue on the 2.7 TDV6. However, there is a second choice. And this second choice, if you could get one of these, you've got something that's never going to be repeated. And it's a really interesting used car purchase because it sits at a time when this sort of thing happened and it worked. And that might sound a bit odd, but in the car world, a lot of things happen. A lot of car engines sort of come out with a car, and then it's just the wrong time. The Audi A2 is a great example of this. Small, efficient, sort of new type of design. People didn't like the look of it at the time. They didn't really get it. And the 1.4 TDI version of that now kind of makes sense. It was this sort of everything car. It was made to be the sort of shape that everyone could fit in. It was made to be incredibly efficient. It was made to be able to do highway speeds, but at the same time, be able to just get you around town. The point of that just meaning that it was sometimes cars do come out and they're at the right car, but it's the wrong time for them. They don't really get appreciated. The 3.6 TDV8 that comes out in the Sport, I think you've got it between 2007 to 2010 in most markets. There are a few facelifts. The facelift, I think, does sort of end the V8 diesel engine, but there you can have a V8 engine, diesel fuel economy, twin turbocharging, reasonably good reliability. They do have a known issue with the turbochargers. If you get the issue with the turbochargers, it's a big job. It's an expensive job. Because of their age, I think you should be able to find one that's already had the turbochargers replaced. If not, and you can buy it cheap enough, just accept, look, if you want to keep this car for the next 5 years, you're buying a car that retailed in the sort of top-end luxury market. So if you need to buy it for $5,000, pounds, euros, whatever, and spend exactly the same on it to keep it on the road, that will be a decision you'll have to make because that's where they are. That's the place they are in their lifespan. And any car, with the exception of a few of the more reliable brands out there like Toyota, Lexus, something like that, almost all of them, especially with a diesel engine, I don't think any brand really could do 20 years without a diesel engine needing just some work. Even those sort of Mercedes that you hear about that do 300,000-400,000 miles, you'll hear someone say, oh, they had to replace an injector. It was no big deal. The garage just said, yeah, one of them's a bit gummed up. We need to replace it. You know, these things happen. On the Range Rover Sport, it's just a bit of a bigger deal. And you get this story of, oh, they have to, you know, split the car in half and they have to do all this work. It's just easier to do it that way. Most specialists, if you tell them, oh, you know, one of the turbochargers is acting up, they'll say, well, replace both at the same time because they've both done the same mileage. And we'll might as well take the frame off the body, the body off the frame, split it in half, much easier access for them. And while they're there, they can do any other sort of small jobs. It becomes a big job. It just does. And it's worth paying a little bit more if someone has had it done and they've had it done at a reputable specialist. Moving on to the facelift though, here you kind of get the ultimate version of the first generation. 5-litre supercharged comes in. It's not as reliable as the 4.2. It does have some early issues, especially with the chain guides. This is all covered, by the way, in the Range Rover Sport buyer's guides, the first and second generation. I'll link them below. You can check them out after the video. Bearing in mind the first generation, this generation we're talking about, that was one of the first videos that ever came up on this channel. So it's not quite at the level I hoped it would be when I compare it to some of the newer stuff, but it will still get the information across. In that first generation, it sort of ends on a bang. 5-litre V8 supercharged, 5-litre in some markets, and you also get it with the 3-litre SDV6, TDV6, the sort of naming changes here. And in the very last year, 2013, if you have it, the diesel engine gets an 8-speed gearbox. And this was sort of Land Rover basically trying out all the stuff that was going to go on the next generation of vehicles in this generation. And so if you go for that last generation, a neighbour of mine actually had one, the very last ones, has an 8-speed gearbox paired with a 3-litre diesel engine. You know, I would just say, if you're going to go for that, you know, preferably the 8-speed would be great. With the 3-litre diesel, just be aware, they haven't quite got the crankshaft issue sorted. Some people think it's a huge issue. Some people think it's a minor issue. As I say, I don't really want to get into it. I do cover it on the buyer's guide, but I think the best way to look at it is if it's been well cared for, you're going in and buying a vehicle that sort of 15 years old, and it may need a large amount of maintenance. It may need no maintenance really at all, other than servicing tyres and brakes, maybe some suspension. That sort of brings us to the end of the first generation. All I would say, the 5-litre supercharged one, it feels like you won't drive anything very similar to that. Not today. I'm trying to think if there's anything even remotely close. Maybe if you live in the US and you've got the Bronco Raptor, and I don't mean it as in like they could directly compete. It's just certain cars give off a certain feel when you drive them, and when you've got this sort of body on frame with modern 5-litre 500 horsepower powertrain, it's a unique experience. It kind of feels like someone's done it in a shed, which to me, as someone who's enthusiastic about cars, are the greatest cars that are made, because well polished, brilliantly made, well put together cars are great for driving to a location and home. And that's what some people, and probably the people that are leaving negative comments about Range Rovers in the comment section, because there's always some, that's probably what they want from a car, and that's all well and good. I can completely understand. There's a lot of people just want a car, home, work, somewhere at the weekend, back home, work. That's all they want from it. Other people, they want a certain feel from a car, and those last 5 litres, I don't know, it just feels like someone called up Range Rover and said, hey, for a couple of years, do you mind if we have a go at sticking the 5-litre in your Range Rover Sport and you sell it in dealers? And they went, oh yeah, give it a go. It feels like a very finished product, but it just feels like two worlds have collided. This sort of older style, you know, let's say having the monocoque on top of a chassis with a modern 5-litre engine, supercharged, huge power. But as I say, just be aware, probably will need a little bit of maintenance. Timing chain guides are quite common on that generation. Moving into the second generation, 2013, and here we get, I think it's the D7U3. I think it is D7U3. Could be wrong. Might be D7UQ or something like that. But it's the same chassis, full-size Range Rover Sport. So if you want your Sport, you want a Range Rover Sport, maybe for size reasons, maybe because you want it, the slightly better handling, slightly lower weight, maybe those things appeal to you. Comparing it off to the first generation here, you do have a very similar car to the full-size Range Rover. It just, when you drive both of them, yes, one does feel a bit smaller, one does feel a little bit more nimble, and a full-size Range Rover has a full-size Range Rover feel. There's no real way to describe it. Go and drive one, you'll get what I mean. But the Sport model here, it brings a lot of that essence along. So what I would say, if you're going to go for this model, early on, sales sort of get really good at about 2015. So peak sales years that you can buy, 15, 16, 17, 18. 18 is the first of the facelift years for this generation. The early engines, if you go for a 5 litre, because that might be your only option, depending on the market that you're in, for that first couple of years, you still have the timing chain issue, so it's good to look for one that has already had that done. Best engines to go for? Tough. Because I could probably go through every engine that they offer, and either someone will think there is a huge issue with their engine, or there will be a huge issue with the engine, or someone will know someone that's had an issue. So I'm going to talk just for a minute about the word Ingenium engine, okay, or 2 words, Ingenium engine, because that seems to gain a very strong reaction from a lot of people that all Ingenium engines, all of them trash, all of them rubbish, just break every 5 minutes, blah, blah, blah. It's simply not true. And where it's come from is that the first generation diesel engine that came out in 2015, it is brought out too early. I don't know that Land Rover would admit that. Even 10 years on, I don't know if they would admit that. But basically, the legislation was changing across Europe. Diesel engines had to go to Euro 6 emissions. The current crop of sort of 2 litre diesel engines that Land Rover had just couldn't pass that barrier. So the Ingenium engine came in, and the diesel ones have quite a lot of issues, especially for the first 2 to 3 years. Then Land Rover get a real hold on them after about 2018, 2019. Even so, I'm going to say probably just to avoid that engine. It's going to be quite stressed, and I would assume for most of you, buying a Range Rover Sport, even used, I know people like to make comments on their finances every 5 minutes, but this is still going to be a high value, expensive purchase. Doesn't matter what your financial situation is. And to get one with a 2 litre that's been, 10 years old, been a bit stressed, 240 horsepower, not too bad, but it's in quite a big vehicle. So I would just say I'd probably put that one off to the side. In the diesels, you have the 3 litre SDV6, pretty much does the whole of production. It gets better for this diesel engine, i.e. the problems that get reported in the first generation with crankshaft issues, the reports do say, and I'm just going off report data here, I'm not going off what people say on the internet, because as I say, it just becomes too much of a, this is the worst one, no, this is the worst one, no, this is the worst one. I don't want to get into that. I can only look at what specialists say, what Land Rover themselves have reported from claims that are made there, but of course, I don't have complete information, because no one does, because people will get their car fixed at, Jerry Two Laces down the road, and it never gets reported anywhere. And I can't tell you how often then, 10-year-old vehicles are having to have huge repairs done when that data is not recorded. What I can say is that at least when I look at them used, there doesn't appear to be that many people talking about having to have major engine work done on their 3 litre SDV6 engine 2015 onwards. Does that mean that those cars just don't get fixed, don't come up for sale? Quite possibly. But I would say they're paired with an 8-speed gearbox, they're highly efficient, they're good engines from the performance specification point of view, from the efficiency point of view, and they make it a good option for someone who's looking at all the costs of owning a Range Rover to seriously look at. If I could choose, I probably wouldn't go for one. And that's a personal opinion. You can check out the guide. I do cover this in more detail for the second generation. That's one of the newer videos, so you'll have a lot more information in that one as to the engines and which one really to pick out. The one I like is the one that I don't know, I think gets overlooked, possibly because the diesel engine existed and that tempted a lot of buyers. It's sort of peak diesel, 2013 to 18. It's really peak diesel years. But there is the 2-litre hybrid that comes out, and that is an Ingenium 2-litre petrol engine. Comes out in about 2018, 2019. As far as I can see reported, and I can only go off what's reported here, they don't have a lot of issues. In fact, some people who have 2-litre Ingenium engines think it's one of the more reliable engines that Land Rover have ever put out onto the market. Other people hear Ingenium and they just think they're all failing. The 2 litres petrol engines have had some reports of some, especially like chain failures, but it's not that common, okay? It just, especially on the Range Rover Sport model, because it's a hybrid engine, the engine's that little bit less stressed. I would seriously look at that car. If you can find a good one, possibly one that's still in the dealer network, and you can get a couple of years warranty added onto your purchase, that would be a serious contender for me. If you like your V8, of course, there is the V8 in this generation, and you have the SVR come out in 2015. 2018, you get the sort of updated SVR. I think the first SVRs will probably, if you're someone that likes to keep your Land Rovers, you buy a Land Rover and you like to go to shows in it and whatever else, the first generation is probably going to have a little marker in Land Rover history forever, because it is that first SVR Range Rover. You can go back to sort of classics and performance versions, but for the SVR brand coming into the Range Rover Sport, 2015, those first ones, that's it. It's a bit like the Vesuvius Orange first edition, early edition of the Range Rover Sport. So if you're that person, that 2015 one is the one to look at. Bearing in mind, timing chain guides are just being sorted at this point. Anyone else, if you want the fastest one, 2018 SVR onwards. Good car. Really good car. If you're in the US, you get the HST model come out in 2015. I think it is 2015, 2016. I think it's 2016 model year. So you may be able to find some from 2015. And that has the supercharged V6 engine with a slight power bump, along with sort of the body kit and stuff like that. That's a really nice choice. If you can find one, they don't sell that many. But if you can find one, that's a serious contender and a nice choice to look at. Just sets you apart a little bit. And so to round out the last of the second generation, I've saved this one, is that they have the 4.4 V8 diesel engine. If you have this available, it's going to cost you a bit more money to buy it than it will the 3-litre V6. And it will have slightly worse fuel efficiency. However, I'll give a quick sort of safety note warning. There have been some reports early on, particularly 2000. So let's just say the first sort of year that they're out, because it will vary a little bit depending on the country you're in. There's started to be a few reports of turbos failing, but that's probably a little bit more to do with mileage and age than it is the actual engine issue. The point here is that if you can go for a 4.4 SDV8, you've got an engine that is a bit like on that first generation V8 diesel. It's on sort of that newer, larger Range Rover chassis, and when you drive that with the diesel engine, it feels like there was a little bit of Range Rover getting involved and saying, this is how we expect the car to drive. I can't explain to you until if you go for a drive, or if you own one, you probably know this feeling. But they've had to make some adjustments over the years into what buyers want, and there was a switch around sort of the mid 90s, late 90s, to people saying, well, can you get a diesel engine in a big luxury vehicle to really feel luxurious? And it took a while. It did take a while. But once they get to these V8 diesel engines, 3.6 on the early one, this 4.4 SDV8 on this second generation, it does everything. You're going to pay a bit more for it, but because you remove the concerns about sort of crankshaft failures and any sort of engine failures that you get with the 3-litre, it's worth it. If you buy it for a bit cheaper on the 3-litre, you may end up paying out more over the sort of term of ownership, even though fuel will cost you less. If you go for the V8, just most of the engine issues aren't really there. you've got a slightly higher servicing bill. A few maintenance issues will come up. But if we assume you're buying 10 years old, a 10-year-old V8 engine, a 10-year-old V8 diesel engine, unless it's been driven, like they're clappers everywhere, and a few of these have, you'll probably spot them. They're ones that have been interestingly modified. If you go for a V8 diesel, yeah, you should be able to avoid most of those issues. So moving on to the final generation now. This one is the L461 platform. It's built on the Flex MLA chassis. So this is being used currently across several different generations of vehicles. I was going to say Jaguar then, but no, it's not being used for Jaguar, and it won't be used for Jaguar because they're doing something else. So it is used between the full-size one and again the Range Rover Sport. Here we transition to the point where now it really is Ingenium engines or a BMW engine. If you're going for the SV model, you'll get an S63. If you're going for the regular model, but you know, the non-SV, it's an N63. This engine was unreliable for BMW when they released it. I'm going to put that straight out there, because if you then go on to Google and you search, BMW N63, you will see reams of reports about how this engine is just the worst thing that BMW have ever made. Stay away from it, run everywhere that you can to get away from it. That is because it comes out on the F10 generation M5, is also in the X5M, in the S63 model. It's then on the 5 Series, the 7 Series, the X5, and one other, I think, BMW model on the N63, and it'd be the 6 Series actually, won't it? They're not great engines originally. They're just not. They're not the most reliable. In fact, they're not reliable engines. In some of the guides for BMWs, I've just said to people on these early ones, just avoid them. It's just the best way. However, kudos to BMW. Some manufacturers give up on engines. Some manufacturers keep working at them and make them good engines. And that is what BMW have done with this V8. It takes them a while, but by 2015, they start to get much better for reliability. By 2018-19, they're good engines. And 20 onwards, these now are reasonably efficient. They're classed technically as high efficient because for a V8, they are very efficient, but compared to, a 2-litre hybrid, they're not efficient at all. So, I'm just going to say they're efficient engines, very powerful engines, and Land Rover have brought them in for the two Range Rovers, the two new generations, to go in the top model cars. Their V8's now gone. It's likely to do with some emissions, looking forward into emissions, and also the idea of creating a whole new engine for yourself rather than buying one from another manufacturer. Sometimes it's just the best financial thing to do. If you're in a country where you're not too worried about regulators, because there'll be a few of you out there that are watching in countries where, there's no sort of intent to ban or restrict the use of your car in cities or whatever else. I'd seriously look at the 3-litre diesel Ingenium if you have it. If you're living in one of the countries I'm talking about, so the UK, many of you watching in the UK, it's just difficult. I don't think it's going to get banned, but I think if you're looking at a long-term purchase, let's say 5 years, 10 years, we're just going to be in a different time then. And regulators are very quick to do things and then ask questions later. And so I would just be a little bit concerned of what they may do. However, if you do want a diesel, and I can't say against it, I can just say just keep that in mind. They do 3 variations, D250, D300, D350. They're all the same engine, just in different tunes, slightly different engineering, but very sort of minor differences between them. D300. The D350 is great. Really great performer. I mean, God, you drive that and you think, how is this a diesel engine? Just revs through, nice performer, still has that diesel torque, but it reminds me, 15 years ago, I think it was, I drove, very few of you would have even heard of this car. The Alfa Romeo did it was a 159 model, and it was a 2.4 JTDM, I think it was. And I remember test driving that car with a customer, didn't really know what it was. To me, it was just an Alfa Romeo, drove them all the time, usually with petrol engines at the time. This one, the customer wanted a diesel. We went down to it. I was like, Alfa Romeo have made a diesel engine that drives like a petrol. It revved to 5,000 RPM, and for all of that 5,000 RPM, it seemed to be able to deliver power. It was like nothing that you got from the sort of VW group at the time, which was very much give it a rev, get through the first gear, and then get the torque going, get yourself into second and third, and then it really sort of lifts and takes off. This was like, it was just like Alfa said, we know we need a diesel engine because that's where the world is, so we're going to do it our way. The newer Ingenium, it has that same sort of power feel to it. You go through the rev range, it's always there, it's always giving you something. You don't ever feel like you're sort of falling back and, you know, needing to get the revs shifted and get the gearbox in the right place. The gearbox is lightning quick. All of these are ZF 8 speeds. So it is very effective, but the mild hybrid, it just keeps the power flowing. You know, just as you need it, yeah, it's there. It's milliseconds. It's really good delivery. So if you're not too worried, and would I be? I spend a lot of time having to look at all of this because of what I do. I'm not that worried, but I know a lot of people are. So if you are worried, I'd probably look at the 3-litre petrol Ingenium engine, but if not, then the 3-litre diesel. Neither of them have got particularly wildly bad reports of reliability. So there's nothing that I'm sort of going to say, watch out for this or this. So far, so good, is what I would say. If you can go for the V8. So you've got BMW engines there, and the plug-in hybrid, that would probably be my pick, if I could pick any one, only because I think plug-in hybrids will increase the amount of people looking for them. They do so much. You'll get 30 miles, let's say 25 to be safe, so sort of 40 kilometers on a charge. For most people, that'll do their Monday to Friday, sort of each day of driving. You can just charge up in the evening, keep them going, and then when they need the engine's there. So that'd probably be my pick. And they're powerful plug-in hybrids as well. I think I'm yet to drive a plug-in hybrid where I get out of it and think, oh, that was slow. You know, and I'm trying to think if one has ever run out of charge and then I've thought, no, I don't think so. I think of all of them I've driven. I'm really scratching my head. I can't think of one. So I like the diesel. I don't have a reason not to tell you to buy the diesel. So, but for high power, or if you've not been able to own one of these cars because your concern has been that you haven't got a specialist and maybe you haven't got a BMW specialist, then 4.4 V8. Go for it. Enjoy it. Probably the last time you're going to get this option, because V8s are disappearing like flies from every corner of the planet. Doesn't matter where you are. You know, we've got muscle cars now coming out as electric. Hey, it's the future of cars. Can't do anything about that. So yeah, that would be the upshot on that. If you've enjoyed the video, then consider subscribing and liking the video. Otherwise, I shall see you next time, and take care until then.